Why medieval life was brutal in ancient Egypt. Welcome, weary traveler, to a journey through the sands of time. As the stars will overhead, and the night grows quiet, I invite you to rest your head, and let your imagination wander to a land of sand and stone, of mighty rivers and towering pyramids. Let's get one thing out of the way before we fall asleep beside a flickering oil lamp in a mud brick house filled with buzzing flies. There is no such thing as the medieval period in ancient Egypt, at least, not officially. The word medieval comes from the Latin medium aevum, the Middle Ages, referring to the time in Europe between the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE and the beginning of the Renaissance in the 14th century. In Europe, it was an era of crumbling empires, rising feudalism, armored knights, plagues, crusades, peasants, and very little bathing. When we hear medieval, we imagine castles, torches, and maybe a chicken leg being eaten without utensils. But Egypt's history doesn't follow that timeline. It just doesn't care what Europe was doing. In fact, by the time Europe was stuck in its long medieval nap, ancient Egypt had already seen kingdoms rise and fall, pyramids built and robbed, gods worshipped and forgotten. It had been invaded, re-invaded, and passed around like an old relic at a dinner party hosted by foreign empires. So why are we calling anything in ancient Egypt medieval? Well, because it's fun, and because when you look closely at the later stages of ancient Egyptian history, especially during the so-called Third Intermediate Period and the Late Period, you start to notice something familiar. Life got harder, people got poorer, authority became more local, fragile, and corrupt. Temples were still busy, but a lot of them were falling apart. Invaders came and went, and the average person just had to keep surviving through it all. That sounds pretty medieval to me. So for our purposes, your sleepy little nighttime journey through the dusty corners of history, we're taking some liberties. We're going to refer to the rough, gritty, everyday life of non-royal Egyptians during the declining periods of their ancient civilization as medieval. We're imagining life between around 1100 BCE and 300 BCE, give or take, when things were no longer golden and glorious, and much more, well, brutal. This was after the peak of the New Kingdom, when pharaohs like Ramesses II strutted around in golden chariots and claimed victory even when they barely survived a battle. By the time we get to the Third Intermediate Period, there are too many pharaohs, too many priests, too many people claiming divine favor, and not nearly enough grain to go around. Egypt was fragmented. There were rival kings in the north and south. There were Libyans and Nubians and eventually Persians stepping in to take charge. The country kept changing hands like a broken pottery shard. The capital even moved around: Thebes, Tanis, Memphis. A power vacuum can get chilly, and no one seemed to want to sit in the same cold seat for very long. The grand temples of earlier centuries still stood, but many were in disrepair, and the people, the ordinary ones, not the scribes or priests, well, they kept waking up before sunrise, tending fields, carrying bricks, getting taxed to the bone, and wondering if the gods had maybe lost interest in their dusty lives. One could say this was a dark age for them, not in the mythic, European sense of darkness, but in the literal, candle-snuffed, economic collapse, general hardship kind of way. And while the state still operated, it wasn't always effective. Central power weakened. Temples and local officials filled the void. If you wanted protection, you looked to your local temple, not the pharaoh. If you wanted a legal dispute settled, you didn't always go to a grand royal court. You went to the priests or the scribes of the nearest town, assuming they weren't busy or corrupt or both. This was a time when bureaucracy ballooned but didn't always function. Think of an overstaffed office, where everyone is technically doing a job, but nothing really works. Papyrus was still being filled out. Records were still being kept. Officials were still wearing fine linen and pretending things were normal. But on the ground, people were bartering instead of using coin, fixing their own roofs, and relying on local alliances to get through a year without starving. And speaking of starving, the economy was shaky. Food security depended heavily on the Nile. A bad flood meant famine. A good flood meant slightly less famine. You could work every day and still come up short. Grain was taxed. Your livestock might be taken, and if you were unlucky, conscripted into labor for a temple or a military campaign far from home. This wasn't the glittering Egypt of the pyramids. This was the era of reuse. Temples were built with stones taken from older structures. Statues were defaced and repurposed. You could be walking past a shrine and see the face of an old god scraped off and a new name carved in. History was layered here, like sediment, one ruler overriding another, one god replacing another, and the people trying to keep their heads down through it all. So when we say medieval life in ancient Egypt, we're really talking about that long twilight of the civilization, that dusty stretch of centuries, where the empire's best days were behind it, but life marched on, where the monuments still stood, but the paint had faded, where rituals were performed because they had to be, not because anyone still believed they'd work, where death was always close by, and the afterlife seemed to offer more promise than the present. It was a time of tired greatness, of splendor crumbling at the edges, of old dreams turning into dry laws and endless taxes. And for the average Egyptian, living in a single-room house with no windows, eating flatbread, and hoping they wouldn't be drafted into some local lord's vanity project, this era must have felt endless. So, no, it wasn't technically medieval, but if you squint and the torchlight flickers just right, you can feel the same tired despair, the same slow decay, the same daily grind, and that's what we're diving into. So fluff your straw pillow, close your eyes, and prepare to drift into a world where the Nile flows endlessly past your crumbling village. Your sandals are made of reeds, and your taxes are paid in grain. Welcome to the medieval side of ancient Egypt. Let's drift further back into the very beginning, not the beginning of civilization, or of the Nile, or of the Pharaoh's dynasty, but the beginning of you. If you had the misfortune to be born a regular child in ancient Egypt, sometime in the long twilight of its empire, you are small, you are wriggling, you are immediately covered in linen, and then you cry. This is your entrance into the world, likely in a modest home made of mud brick, its walls plastered and painted if your parents had time. The floor is dusty, the ceiling is low, the smells are not great. You were likely born at home, not in a temple, unless your mother served there, and there is no doctor, just a midwife, some herbs, some chants, and a whole lot of hope. Childbirth was dangerous, very dangerous, even more so than today. For the mother, for the child, for anyone involved. Infection was common, the tools were crude. You might be swaddled in linens touched with amulets and blessed oils. The gods were invoked, Taweret, the hippo-shaped goddess of childbirth, and Bes, the strange dwarf god, who guarded mothers and babies with his grotesque grin. The walls may even have had protective charms carved or painted into them, but none of it guaranteed survival. Infant mortality rates were painfully high. Some scholars estimate that as many as 1 in 3 children didn't make it past their first few years. If you were lucky, very lucky, you survived to toddle. And toddle you would, barefoot on a floor littered with bits of straw. Maybe a broken piece of pottery or two. There were no toys from a market. Maybe a carved doll, or a clay animal, if someone had the time. But don't get too attached to your doll. Childhood doesn't last long here. By the age of 4 or 5, you're already expected to help. If your family farms, you might be out in the field with a small pot, gathering weeds or collecting dung. If your family bakes, you help grind the grain, pushing the heavy stone over and over until your hands blister. If your father's a fisherman, you watch the nets. If your mother's a weaver, you're untangling threads. There is no school, not for you, unless your parents are scribes or priests. Those children are different. They sit with wooden tablets, copying lines, learning signs, preparing for a life of ink and scrolls. You are not one of them. You're one of the other children, the ones who will never write their names, the ones whose stories will not be preserved on papyrus or stone, the ones who will work and sweat and disappear. And the work is constant. It's hot. The sun does not pity children, neither do adults. Your family is practical. They don't believe in indulgence. They love you, in their own way, but they also need you to pull your weight. If you're lazy, you're punished. There are no tantrums here, no days off. By the time you're 7 or 8, You're almost treated like a small adult. You carry water from the well. You help in the markets. You learn the tasks of your parents, because one day, you'll do them full time. Childhood is a brief moment, like a cool breeze before the heat returns. If you're a girl, your path is a little different. You stay closer to the home. You help with cooking, cleaning, spinning, baking. You learn how to grind flour, how to knead dough, how to sweep ash from the hearth. Your games, when you have time for them, involve pretend cooking, pretend weddings. You are being trained for your future from the moment you can walk. Marriage might come early. By the age of 12 or 13, many girls were already married, sometimes by choice, often not. Your family might decide. The husband might be twice your age. It's normal. It's expected. There is no teenage rebellion. There is no finding yourself. You grow up fast, and then you stay grown. For boys, the expectation is slightly different, but not by much. By 10, you're strong enough to help with harvests. You carry sacks of grain. You fetch tools. You learn how to plant, how to irrigate, how to obey. If your father is a craftsman, maybe a potter or a builder, you begin your apprenticeship. Not formally, just by doing what he does. Watching, repeating, getting it wrong, getting yelled at, doing it again. Some boys, the luckiest ones, get into scribe schools. These are the children of privilege. They learn to write. They sit under stern teachers and copy rows of symbols. They get beaten with sticks if they make mistakes. Yes, education is valuable, but it is not gentle. You are scolded for bad handwriting. You are beaten for forgetting a line. You are molded like clay, and not always well. Play. Yes, there is a little. Children are children, after all. You might chase a hoop. You might float a toy boat in a canal. You might wrestle in the dust with your siblings, but always under the watchful eye of adults. Always with the sense that your time could be better spent grinding grain or hauling something somewhere. Illness is constant. You catch things all the time. Worms, infections, fevers. Your teeth begin to wear down young, from the gritty bread full of sand. You get bitten by insects. You might lose a sibling to disease. You might lose two. And death is not rare. It's expected. It's planned for. Children had amulets, tiny scarabs for protection, strings of beads, small charms with the eye of Horus, meant to ward off evil. But still, fevers come. Accidents happen. A scorpion might crawl under your blanket. The river might sweep you away. Your parents have seen it before. They'll grieve, but they'll keep going, because that's life here. It begins hard, and it stays hard. If you're lucky, you live long enough to work harder. You grow up under the gaze of ancient gods, who seem, from the ground, distant and silent. You hear the priests chant in temples, smell the incense in the air, but you never go inside. That world is closed to you. You are part of the endless cycle outside the walls. The peasants, the workers, the people who keep Egypt running. Your childhood is not about dreams. It's about survival. It's about duty. It's about becoming what your parents were, and hoping your own children survive long enough to do the same. And when you fall asleep, if the insects aren't too loud, and the heat isn't too much, you dream not of magic or freedom, but maybe of better bread, of cooler shade, of just one day without chores. And in the morning, you'll wake up, wash your face in a bowl of warm water, and do it all again. Let's now imagine, just for a moment, the place you'd return to after a long day in the field, or after hours of grinding grain until your hands atched. Your home, the place you sleep, eat, bathe, argue, and exist. Or rather, where everyone you know also sleeps, eats, bathes, argues, and exists, because in ancient Egypt, especially if you were not rich, privacy was a luxury you probably never experienced. Most ordinary homes in ancient Egypt were not palatial. They were not filled with silks or scrolls. They were not cool in summer or warm in winter. They were made of mud brick, dried in the sun, and carefully stacked to form simple, practical rectangles. If you were fortunate, the walls were whitewashed to reflect sunlight. If not, you lived in something that resembled a tiny clay oven, and it often felt just as hot. These homes were usually 1 or 2 rooms. That's it. No bedrooms. No kitchens, as we know them. No separate bathrooms. Just walls, a roof, and maybe a stairwell to access the flat top, where, if the weather allowed, you might sleep under the stars to escape the heat below. Inside, everything was multi-purpose. The same room that served as your eating area was also where you slept. The floor was covered with mats made of palm fibers. Furniture was minimal: a low table, a couple of baskets, perhaps a wooden stool. A small shrine, dedicated to household gods, might be tucked into a corner, but mostly, it was just people and stuff. And heat. Always heat. Your entire family would sleep in that one room. Mother, father, children, maybe a grandparent or two. If there were infants, they slept alongside everyone else. There were no doors to close for alone time. No curtains. No separate space to go cry or read or think. Everything you did within earshot of at least 3 relatives. If someone had a cough, everyone heard it. If someone sniffed, everyone endured it. Cooking happened in the same space, or just outside, in a small courtyard if you were lucky. There might be a clay oven, essentially a hole lined with hot coals. Pots were placed on low stands. Firewood was precious, and so cooking was often done quickly, with flatbread slapped against hot surfaces. The smoke filled the house. There was no chimney. The ceiling beams darkened over time, coated in the soot of countless meals. And the smells. The smells. You'd get the scent of bread baking, yes, but also of old fish, and animal dung used as fuel, and the unwashed bodies of family members, who had been laboring in the sun all day. Baths were taken sparingly, often with water fetched by hand from the river or a nearby canal. Soap wasn't really a thing. You might use natron, a type of salty mineral, to scrub yourself. That left a dryness, a runness to the skin, which was better than nothing. There was no plumbing. Let's say that again. No plumbing. Waste was either collected in clay pots and dumped outside, or, in many cases, taken directly to the edge of the settlement and disposed of. If you were near the Nile, it might be flung into the river, along with everyone else's, which, of course, made that water a bit of a gamble to drink. Some homes had latrines, but these were very primitive, a seat over a pot, perhaps, and most of these were reserved for slightly wealthier families. For you, a trip to the outside wall with a bit of discretion was probably the norm. At night, you held it in or used a jar in the corner. And you weren't the only one. Privacy during bathing. Forget it. You washed yourself while others stood nearby. Children bathed together. Adults wiped off with cloths. There was no such thing as locking a door and enjoying a quiet soak. Bathing was another task, quick, functional, slightly unpleasant. And if you were married, romance was public. Not in a scandalous way, but in a there is no place to go sort of way. Intimacy happened behind a curtain, if there was one, or late at night when everyone else was asleep, or pretending to be. There was no illusion of secrecy. You learned to ignore, to pretend, to be silent. Families were large, not just in terms of children, but in terms of generations. Grandparents often lived in the same house, sometimes cousins, too. You might be sharing your home with 8 or 10 people, and even if you had a separate space, say, a small storage alcove, you probably shared that with chickens, or tools, or jars of fermented fish paste. Storage, after all, was minimal. Food was kept in clay containers. Tools were leaned against walls. Clothes, what little you had, were hung or folded into baskets. There were no closets, no drawers, no folding doors. And yes, there were pests. Lice, fleas, flies. Rats came in when they wanted. Cats, famously beloved by Egyptians, were often welcome guests, but not in the cuddly modern sense. They were tools. They kept the vermin population down. You didn't buy a cat bed. You just let the animal curl up in a warm spot. If it stuck around, you were lucky. You got used to noise. Babies cried. Dogs barked. Neighbors shouted. Children fought. There was no insulation. Your neighbor's argument could be heard as clearly as if they were in the room with you, because sometimes the walls were just that thin. And that neighbor, you saw them all the time. You lived close, really close. Houses were packed together in tight clusters. Courtyards bled into each other, roofs connected, streets were narrow, and many homes opened right onto them. If you walked out your door, you were practically in your neighbor's doorway. And if you needed to borrow something, grain, wool, firewood, you just asked, or shouted, or sent a child, because you lived in a community. And while that might sound comforting, it also meant that everyone knew everything. Gossip was rampant. Secrets were short-lived. You might share bread one day and get into a shouting match the next, but you still lived 20 paces from one another. There was no escape. The temples and palaces had space. They had walls, gardens, privacy. You did not. And yet, you managed. People married. Children were raised. Bread was baked. Life continued in these crowded, shared, overheated spaces. You adapted to the noise, the smell, the closeness. You learned to carve out little corners of silence in your mind. Or maybe, after years, you stopped noticing. Because this wasn't unusual. It was normal. Everyone lived this way. And so you never expected more. This was home. Imagine the sun rising. Again. It always rises. And it always burns. There is no alarm clock. But your body knows. You wake with the first hint of light, filtering through a reed screen or a small, dusty window slit in your mud-brick wall. Before the heat thickens the air, before the flies start their buzzing, you stretch your arms and prepare for another day. Because in ancient Egypt, especially for the common people, life was labor. Every day, from childhood to old age, you worked, not for ambition, not for luxury, not even for comfort, but simply to survive. Let's start with the farmers, the backbone of Egypt's entire economy. If you were one of them, and most people were, you didn't own the land you worked. The land belonged to the pharaoh, or to a temple, or to some nobleman you'd never met, but you still had to farm it. That was the deal. And so, your year followed the Nile. You lived and labored by its rhythms. Inundation season, Akhet, was the flooding time. The waters rose, covering the fields in a thick, muddy blanket. You couldn't plant then, so you repaired tools, strengthened levees, cleared irrigation canals clogged with silt. You paid taxes, or, more likely, you worried about how you would. When the waters receded, planting season began, and it was frantic. Seeds needed to go in fast. You plowed using simple tools, often just a sharpened stick pulled behind an ox. If you couldn't afford an ox, and many couldn't, you used your own body. You stooped, bent, dug with your hands. You sowed grain, lentils, barley. You hoped for rain, but not too much. Then came Shimu, the harvest. Everything you planted needed to come out before the next flood. You worked from sunup to sundown, swinging sickles made of wood and flint, gathering grain into baskets. The sun bore down. You sweated, you bled. You kept going. There were no gloves, no hats, no sunscreen, just a linen wrap around your head, a hope that your back would hold out, and the occasional prayer to the gods of the field. And when the harvest was over, you didn't get to keep it. A portion went to your overseer. Another portion went to the temple, more to the tax collector. You kept what was left, if anything. Some years, that meant abundance. Other years, it meant hunger. Famine was always a season away. If you weren't a farmer, maybe you worked in construction. Temples, tombs, walls. Egypt was always building something. And while we often imagine slaves hauling stones for the pyramids, the truth is that most workers were hired or conscripted. You might be called up for a season of labor, forced to leave your family behind for months at a time. You were paid in bread and beer, maybe some onions or dried fish. Your tools were crude, your tasks repetitive. You carried bricks made of mud and straw. You stacked them, you carried more. You might be told to chisel stone, or haul it up a ramp, or mix mortar with your bare feet. In Deir el Medina, a village for tomb workers, we see the closest thing to a working-class neighborhood in ancient times. These were skilled artisans, painters, carvers, masons, who built the tombs of pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings. They had houses, families, and even some protections, but they still labored hard, in cramped, hot spaces, day after day. They still faced punishment if they slacked. They still died young. Elsewhere, You might find yourself assigned to a quarry. These were brutal, remote, sun-blasted, and dangerous. You chipped away at limestone or granite with bronze tools that dulled fast. Dust filled your lungs. The air shimmered with heat. Water was rationed. So was rest. Or maybe you were in a mine, deep underground, swinging a pick, filling baskets, crawling through tight, dark spaces, praying nothing collapsed. If you were a woman, your labor was constant too, but different. You ground flour. You fetched water, sometimes walking miles. You wove linen, one thread at a time. You cared for children, made beer, kept the fire burning, baked bread, cleaned, mended, and served. Your day began early and ended late. You labored in silence, unseen by the state, but essential to its survival. Some women also worked outside the home, serving as musicians in temples, or brewers, or vendors in markets. But most did the invisible labor, the kind no scribe wrote down. And let's not forget the corvée system, the ancient version of a draft. The state could summon you at any time, to dig canals, build walls, serve in the army. It didn't matter what your plans were. You were summoned, you went, or you paid someone else to go in your place, if you could afford it, which you couldn't. Work injuries were common. There were no safety rails, no ointments for blisters. A cut could fester, a fall could cripple you, a bad back might mean no income, and there was no disability pay. You worked until you couldn't. Then your family either picked up the slack or starved. Your tools were basic: wood, stone, bronze if you were lucky. The wheelbarrow hadn't been invented yet. You carried everything in baskets or on your shoulders. Your clothes were minimal, a loincloth or simple tunic. You went barefoot unless you were rich. Your hands were calloused. Your muscles knotted. Your sleep, when it came, was heavy and dreamless. And yet, despite all this, work was life. It was how you proved yourself, how you showed devotion to your household, your community, your gods. There were festivals and rest days, especially tied to the agricultural calendar, but even these might involve work, cleaning, preparing, serving someone richer than you. So day after day, under the same blistering sun, you labored. You carried and pushed, and pounded and hauled. Your sweat joined the Nile, your footprints filled with dust. And when you finally sat down at night, with a bowl of lentils and a jug of sour beer, you exhaled. And for a few hours, you stopped. But only for a few, because the sun would rise again tomorrow, and you'd get up, and do it all again. Let's now move from the sweat and sun of daily labor to something quieter, but no less brutal. The slow ache of hunger, the dull throb of sickness, the simple, looming fact that at any time, and for any reason, you might die. Living in ancient Egypt meant waking up every morning and wondering, in some quiet part of your mind, if you'd live to see the evening. And if you did, if you survived the insects and the water and the work, would your children? Let's begin with food. Egypt was, in theory, fertile. The Nile's yearly flooding made the soil rich, but that didn't mean abundance for everyone. It meant abundance for temples, nobles, scribes. For you, it meant grain, lots of it. Bread and beer formed the core of the peasant diet. That's not a metaphor. It was literally bread and beer, every day, all day. Bread was made from emmer wheat or barley, ground by hand on stone. And that grinding process, it filled the flour with sand, not on purpose. It was just how the tools worked. The stones wore down, the grit mixed in, and you baked it anyway. Over time, this sand wore your teeth down to stubs. It's not uncommon for mummies of even young adults to show teeth worn nearly flat, cracked, infected, or gone entirely. And the bread itself wasn't always fresh. It could be hard, dense, riddled with grain husks or mold, but it was filling, and it was fuel. Beer was another staple, not bubbly, golden beer like we imagine, but a thick, porridge-like brew made from half-baked loaves soaked and fermented. It was nutritious, it was safe to drink, and it was usually consumed in large quantities, sometimes by children, because it was better than the water, at least in terms of bacteria. Now, meat, forget it. Unless it was a festival, a wedding, or a funeral, meat was rare. If you had it, it was usually salted fish, or dried fowl, or scraps of offal. The rich had roasted goose, grilled beef, whole chickens glazed with honey. You had lentils on a good day. Fruits and vegetables came in season. Onions, leeks, cucumbers, dates, figs. But not everyone had access to them. If your harvest failed, or your village suffered a drought, you might eat nothing but coarse bread for weeks, or not eat at all. Famine was a constant threat. If the Nile failed to flood, or flooded too much, fields were ruined, crops drowned, starvation followed. Entire towns might be wiped out. Parents watched children waste away. Communities vanished into silence. And then there was sickness. You lived close to animals, chickens, goats, dogs, maybe even a cow, all sharing the same dusty courtyard. Waste wasn't managed. Water wasn't clean. Mosquitoes bit. Flies swarmed. Parasites nested. Your body was under attack at all times. You might suffer from malaria, or dysentery, or intestinal worms. Eye infections were common, so common that there were specific spells and amulets just for conjunctivitis. Children often had shaved heads, not for style, but to keep lice at bay. The Nile itself, your source of water, transport, and spiritual renewal, was also your greatest risk. You bathed in it, you drank from it, but it carried everything: waste, disease, death. Doctors existed, but don't picture hospitals. Healers worked from home, using mixtures of honey, resin, garlic, and magic. A broken bone might be splinted well, if you were lucky, but internal illness, that was beyond their reach. You might be bled, you might be smeared with ointment, you might be prayed over, and then you might die. Injuries were everywhere. A stumble on uneven stones, a cut from a chisel, a scorpion sting, an infected blister. Without antibiotics, even a small wound could turn septic. Your only hope was rest, and if rest wasn't an option, which it often wasn't, you worked through the pain. Women faced unique risks. Childbirth was deadly. No antiseptics, no trained doctors, no surgery, just herbs, prayers, and luck. Even a healthy mother might bleed to death, or develop an infection that slowly killed her. And for the baby, as many as 1 in 3 never survived to age 5. Mothers often lost multiple children. Some might never speak their names aloud. They were mourned quickly, silently. Life moved forward. It had to. And yet, despite the constant threat of death, people lived. They laughed. They sang. They told stories. They passed down jokes, painted games on walls, danced at festivals. But death was always near. It wasn't something to fear. It was simply part of life, expected, accepted, and ever present. There were gods for healing, gods for protection, but also gods for death, and mummification, and the afterlife. The boundary between life and death was thin, and people lived on that line every day. A child might die of fever. A mother might die in childbirth. A man might fall from a cart and never rise. A fisherman might slip beneath the Nile and vanish. And still, the fields had to be plowed. The bread had to be baked. The taxes had to be paid. You might cough for weeks and keep working. You might bury a sibling and go back to grinding flour the next morning. Grief was a luxury. There was no time to stop. So you worked. You swallowed your aches. You chewed the gritty bread. You drank the thick beer. And every morning you woke up, you whispered thanks to the gods, for breath, for light, for the simple fact that you had survived, until the day you didn't. In ancient Egypt, religion was not just a personal belief, or something reserved for special holidays. It was everywhere. It was in your food, your clothing, your work, your rest. The gods were not just watching from afar, they were watching from the room next door, the water in your jar, the field you were tilling, the illness you caught, and even the bread you burned that morning. The ancient Egyptians believed in an intricate system of deities, dozens upon dozens of them. There wasn't just one god in charge of everything. Instead, there were gods for nearly every aspect of life. Ra was the sun, Osiris was death, Isis was motherhood and magic, Thoth governed writing, Hapi controlled the Nile, Sekhmet, war and plague, Based, protection and cats, Taweret, childbirth. Even scarab beetles had divine symbolism. If it moved, glowed, bit, or breathed, there was likely a god behind it. And that sounds beautiful, this poetic universe, humming with spirits and order. But if you were a common person, it wasn't so poetic. It was exhausting. To live in Egypt was to live under constant divine scrutiny. The gods needed to be honored, or terrible things might happen. You didn't just believe in them. You had to serve them, actively, relentlessly, and often without clear understanding of why. There were rituals, so many rituals. Before you harvested your field, you had to offer a prayer to Renenetet, goddess of the harvest. Before you brewed beer, you'd nod to Tenenet, goddess of childbirth and beer. Before entering a temple or even a tomb, you had to cleanse yourself. You washed your hands. You poured water over your feet. You recited spells, even if you couldn't read. You learned them from memory, passed down like lullabies, whispered from your mother's lips. Every month had festivals. Every season had observances. These might involve fasting, or feasting, or carrying statues through the streets, or slaughtering animals, or sitting still and doing nothing all day. The problem was, you couldn't always tell which it was. If you got it wrong, you didn't get a gentle correction. You got illness, misfortune, maybe the death of a child, because clearly, the gods were angry. The priesthood controlled this whole system. They were the interpreters, the go-betweens. But they didn't serve your god. They served the gods of the state, the temples, and the ruling elite. Unless you were a scribe or artisan in temple service, your access to these spiritual bureaucrats was limited. You didn't enter the temple's sacred chamber. You didn't speak directly to the divine statue. You stood outside, perhaps squinting into the sun, while incense curled into the air and sacred music drifted from within. And priests didn't just pray, they washed the gods, literally. Every day, they would clean the statues, dress them in linen, offer them food, apply makeup. The gods needed constant care, like children with enormous cosmic powers. And the punishment for failing them wasn't a stern look. It was chaos, drought, war, disease, the very unraveling of the world. This fear of chaos, called Isfet, was everywhere. The opposite of Mot, or divine order. It represented everything bad, lies, disorder, violence, hunger. Your job as a tiny human cog in this divine system was to uphold Mot, not just by behaving, but by existing properly, saying the right words, wearing the right clothes, burying your dead with the proper amulets, making sure the stars were not offended by your bad posture or impure thoughts. Imagine the pressure. You couldn't just eat any food. Some animals were sacred in certain regions, crocodiles in one place, rams in another, cats everywhere. Killing one, even by accident, could earn you death. If a sacred animal died, its body was mummified, buried with ceremony, and sometimes mourned more extravagantly than the local peasants. And let's not forget oracles. You might travel for days to consult one. Would your daughter survive childbirth? Would your crops grow? Should you marry your cousin's son? A priest would pose the question to a god, perhaps carried in procession, and interpret the nods, jerks, or tilts of the divine statue. Yes, no, yes, no. Like a mystical magic 8-ball, but with much higher stakes. Then there were taboos, rules specific to your role, your region, your gender. Perhaps you couldn't wear leather, or eat fish on certain days, or say the name of a god aloud. Breaking these rules, even unknowingly, invited divine punishment. And unlike earthly punishments, you couldn't appeal. The gods didn't offer refunds. Death didn't end the anxiety. It just introduced new requirements. To enter the afterlife, your soul had to pass the weighing of the heart. Your heart, believed to record every deed, was weighed against the feather of Mot, too heavy, and your soul was devoured by the monstrous Ammit, part lion, part crocodile, part hippo. You didn't go to hell. You just stopped. Utter annihilation. To avoid this, you needed spells, hundreds of them, which meant paying for a copy of the Book of the Dead, or more likely, paying someone else to know them for you. If you couldn't afford a scribe, you relied on whatever your family remembered, and you'd better hope they didn't forget line 42 about the smiting of crocodiles in the region of the western wind, or your soul might get stuck in the sand forever. And all of this pressure, this obligation, wasn't questioned, because questioning was dangerous. Heresy wasn't just forbidden, It was incomprehensible. What kind of person wouldn't want to honor the gods? What kind of monster would ignore the rising sun or fail to offer water to the tombs of ancestors? The gods gave order, and they demanded obedience in return. You couldn't opt out. You couldn't say, "This isn't for me." Religion wasn't a side activity. It was the framework for everything, the glue that held society together. And for the common person, it was also a kind of spiritual exhaustion. Imagine waking up and wondering if today is the festival of Wepet Renpet. Do you need to fast? Do you need to feast? Is it unlucky to cut your hair today? Will the gods be angry if you skip the offering because your child is sick? You could get it wrong, and you probably did, often. And then something bad would happen, and everyone would nod and say the gods had been displeased. You'd murmur a prayer, light a lamp, offer a fig, if you had one, and hope. It wasn't just faith, it was fear. And yet, people found comfort in it too. They wore amulets shaped like scarabs or ankhs or eyes. They whispered prayers to Bes, the dwarf god of childbirth, or to Hathor, for love and music. They sang hymns to Ra as the sun set. They held funerals with tears and songs in hope that the dead would be welcomed by Osiris. Because even in oppression, there was meaning. A child's recovery was a sign of divine mercy. A good harvest proved that the gods were listening. And when you died, if you had followed all the rules, made all the offerings, memorized all the spells, you might find yourself in the field of reeds, an idealized version of Egypt, with cool breezes, green crops, and no labor. But to get there, you had to make it through a lifetime of divine obligation. You had to survive the whims of invisible beings. You had to navigate a theology that never gave you rest. You had to live in fear of saying the wrong word or forgetting the right one. And even then, you might still fail, because the gods were powerful, but they were not kind. When we think of childhood, especially from the safety of modern comfort, we often imagine softness, play, learning, innocence. But in ancient Egypt, childhood was not a protected category. It was not a time apart from hardship, but simply the beginning of it. Children were not spared the brutality of the world. They were born into it, and they were expected to adapt quickly. You entered life as a risk. Childbirth was dangerous. Even in the most favorable conditions, a baby might not survive the first day, let alone the first year. There were no incubators, no antiseptics, no safe cesarean procedures. If you were born breech, if the umbilical cord tangled, if your mother hemorrhaged, there was nothing to be done. Both of you might die. And if you survived, you faced a gauntlet of dangers. Infant mortality was staggeringly high. As many as 30 to 40% of children died before age 5. Disease, malnutrition, infection, accidents, all took their toll. The Nile Valley, for all its fertility, was swarming with bacteria. Flies and mosquitoes infested everything. Drinking water carried parasites. Food was often contaminated. Breastfeeding helped, and mothers typically nursed their children for 3 years or more. But even so, survival was never guaranteed. There were no pediatricians, no vaccines, no antibiotics. If a child developed a fever, a rash, a cough, a stomachache, it could be deadly. And yet, life didn't pause. Mothers still had to work. Fathers still had to fulfill quotas and taxes. If a child got sick, you prayed, you brewed herbs, you hoped, but often, you just waited. If a child died, grief followed, but so did silence. Infant burials were often simple, even rushed. Some were placed in baskets or pots and buried beneath the house. Others were laid in community cemeteries, without names. There was little time for mourning. The work continued, and for the child who survived, life began early. There was no long childhood, no decade of leisure or schooling. By the time a child could walk, they began helping, fetching water, carrying firewood, feeding animals, watching younger siblings. Playing and labor blurred together. Even games, if you had time for them, were often teaching tools for adult life. If you were a boy born into a farming family, you might start helping in the fields by age 5 or 6, carrying seed baskets, chasing away birds, pulling weeds. You'd learn to walk in the heat, to listen to your father's instructions, to copy the gestures of men with hoes and sickles. If your family were craftsmen, you learned the trade, carving stone, shaping mud bricks, smoothing wood. Boys trained under their fathers, uncles, or neighbors. There was no formal apprenticeship, just endless repetition, observation, and correction. If you made a mistake, you were hit. If you didn't learn, you were shamed. Children's hands were expected to become calloused, fast. If you were a girl, your training was no easier. You learned to grind grain daily, endlessly. You fetched water from the river. You helped prepare bread, carry loads, sweep floors. You took care of siblings. You helped birth livestock. By your early teens, you might be married. And yes, marriage came early. Girls often married around 12 or 13, boys around 15 or 16. But these were averages. If your family needed an alliance, or simply needed one less mouth to feed, you might be given away younger. Marriage wasn't usually romantic. It was practical. It meant survival. And pregnancy followed soon after. A girl who had played with dolls one year might be carrying a child the next. Did children receive an education? Some did, but only a tiny minority. Formal education was for boys of elite families, the sons of scribes, priests, or bureaucrats. They were sent to temple schools, where they learned hieroglyphics, mathematics, religious texts, and law. These were not gentle places. The texts themselves describe beatings as normal. A boy's ear is on his back. He listens when he is beaten, says one scribe's manual. These students trained to become scribes, a prestigious and secure career. They would avoid manual labor, sit in offices, manage records, and enjoy a status far above the farmers and herders. But for every boy who learned to write, there were thousands who didn't. They worked the land, not the pen. Girls were excluded from most education. They might learn domestic skills or, if wealthy, be taught music or weaving, but they would not become scribes. Their futures lay in the household, and their value was tied to fertility, not fluency. Children were also deeply spiritual beings in the Egyptian mind. Certain gods watched over them: Bes, the squat, lion-faced protector, and Taveret, the hippo-bodied goddess of childbirth. Amulets were placed on children to keep them safe. Ankhs, eyes of Horus, protective symbols. Infants might wear strings of beads or cowrie shells to ward off evil, but these protections were symbolic, not effective. Children still drowned in the Nile. They were still bitten by snakes. They still got trampled, or burned, or disappeared. Life was fragile, and even magic had its limits. Clothing was minimal in early childhood. Most young children wore nothing at all until age 6 or 7. The heat made clothing unnecessary, and a naked child was normal, especially among peasants. As they aged, they might wear simple linen shifts or loincloths. Jewelry was common if the family could afford it: bracelets, collars, or carved amulets tied around the neck. Toys existed, but they were rare. A child might have a carved animal, an ox on wheels, a crocodile with a moving jaw. Dolls were made of wood, straw, or clay, often with beaded hair. But playtime was a luxury, and toys were handmade, passed down, or improvised. You played with pebbles, sticks, mud. There were games: Senet, a kind of board game; Hounds and Jackals, a race game; Knucklebones, wrestling. But again, only when there was time. For most children, the rhythm of life was dominated by work. Play happened in gaps, in the hour before dusk, or while watching a sibling nap. And then there was discipline. Beatings were common. Fathers struck sons. Mothers struck daughters. Teachers struck students. Discipline was physical, immediate, and unquestioned. Respect for elders was paramount. Obedience was survival. Some ancient texts even include model lessons about proper child behavior. One, written by a scribe, instructs, "Do not walk with an ignorant man. His heart is full of disturbance." Another warns against laziness, idleness, or questioning one's elders. Children were not encouraged to ask why. They were expected to say yes. Children were also miniature adults in spiritual responsibility. By age 5 or 6, they participated in religious rituals. They lit lamps, carried offerings, memorized prayers. In some households, a child might be the designated guardian of the family shrine, If the proper rites were not performed, the gods might punish the whole family. So a child's behavior mattered, spiritually. One mistake, and it wasn't just your parents' temper you faced, it was divine wrath. Despite this harshness, love existed. Parents wept over lost children. Names were carved into tombs. Songs and lullabies have been preserved on papyrus. Songs of protection, of comfort, of love. One hymn asks the gods to place your arms around the child as you would your own. Another describes a mother singing to her child as the evening wind passes through the reeds. There were moments of tenderness, even within the brutality. But tenderness didn't protect you. If you were a child in ancient Egypt, your life was short, hard, and uncertain. You labored, you obeyed, you suffered. And if you were lucky, you reached adulthood and began the whole cycle again, this time as the parent. In ancient Egypt, the walls of temples and tombs celebrate order, beauty, and divine harmony. Pharaohs stand tall, gods extend their blessings, and noblemen recline with lotus flowers while servants tend to their every need. But just outside the scenes of leisure and glory, sometimes carved into the margins, sometimes not depicted at all, were the enslaved. Their lives were not illuminated in gold or ink. They were anonymous, interchangeable, and brutally necessary. Slavery in ancient Egypt wasn't always how we might imagine it. There weren't sprawling plantations like in the American South. Nor was it always chattel slavery, where people were permanently and irrevocably property. But make no mistake, there were people in Egypt who were owned. Their labor, their bodies, their children, their fates were not theirs to control. And often, they were forgotten just as easily as they were acquired. Slavery took many forms in Egypt, and not all were equal. There were war captives, who were among the lowest, taken in campaigns against the Nubians, Libyans, or Asiatics. They were marched back across the desert or up the Nile, chained, dehydrated, malnourished, and terrified. They were paraded through the cities as spoils of victory. Some were executed. The rest were distributed like livestock. Pharaohs gave them as gifts to temples. Officials claimed them for their estates. Soldiers might be rewarded with a living plow, a human being to use as labor. These captives were sometimes branded, not metaphorically, physically, burned or tattooed with marks to show ownership. They were stripped of names, languages, and identities. Their children, if they lived long enough to have them, were born into servitude as well. They worked in mines. The most brutal assignments were in the gold mines of Nubia or the turquoise mines of the Sinai. These places were not just remote, they were death zones. Temperatures could soar past 40 degrees C, over 100 degrees F. Water was scarce. Tunnels collapsed. The air was thick with dust and toxic minerals. Workers were beaten, starved, and pushed to collapse. Many did not survive a month. They were buried nearby, if they were buried at all. Others were forced into agriculture. Egypt's economy depended on grain, flax, onions, garlic, barley. Enslaved people cleared fields, sowed crops, and harvested under the sun. They lifted massive sacks, trudged through irrigation ditches, broke soil with crude tools. Supervisors watched from shade, whip in hand. If you slowed down, you were struck. If you resisted, you might be killed. In elite households, slaves worked as domestic servants. They cooked, they cleaned, they fetched water, they watched over children, sometimes raising them from birth, though they would never be considered family. They dressed and perfumed their owners, kneeling while noblewomen applied makeup, or noblemen combed their wigs. Some were trained to sing or play instruments, entertaining their masters at feasts. Others stood silently by, eyes downcast, waiting to be summoned. Women were particularly vulnerable. Enslaved women could be forced into concubinage or outright sexual slavery. There were no legal protections. If a master wanted you, he took you. Any child born from such an arrangement belonged to the master's household. Some were raised as servants. Others became minor heirs. And sometimes, enslaved women were blamed for the very pregnancies forced upon them, accused of seduction or witchcraft. Punishment was arbitrary. A slave could be beaten for speaking out of turn, for spilling a jar, for not bowing quickly enough. They might be mutilated, ears cut off, Hands chopped, faces scarred. Some records describe punishments like cutting out tongues or blinding. These were not rumors. They were methods of control. Fear was the leash. And yet, slaves weren't always invisible. In some rare cases, they were recorded in household documents or temple inventories. One female servant from Haiti, 2 Nubian field hands, boy of no known father, kept for errands. These were not names. They were labels, like tools or oxen, and they were listed next to animals, furniture, baskets. Some slaves had relative stability. Skilled slaves, those who could carve stone, shape pottery, weave fine linen, were more valuable. They might be fed better, clothed more warmly. Some were trusted with responsibilities, but they were still property. A change in owner, a bad harvest, a whim of anger, and they were disposable. The legal system recognized slavery, but not justice for the enslaved. A master could punish a slave without cause. If a slave injured a free person, it was a crime. If a free person injured a slave, it was usually not. If a slave fled, they could be hunted down and returned, or executed. There were no courts for their appeals, no records of their voices, no rights. Children of slaves were often born into bondage, especially those born to foreign captives. But sometimes, a child might be adopted, manumitted, or absorbed into the household. These cases were rare, and usually motivated by convenience, not compassion. A child who served well might be kept around. A child who caused trouble might be sold or abandoned. Could slaves be freed? Occasionally, yes. Some were manumitted, granted freedom after years of loyal service. But even then, freedom didn't mean equality. A freed slave had no land, no wealth, no name of honor. They might become hired laborers, or slip back into servitude under a new master. Temples were large-scale slaveholders. The god Ammon, for example, was served by thousands of workers, many of whom were enslaved. The priests managed vast estates, fields, bakeries, workshops, all powered by forced labor. These slaves didn't serve Ammon directly. They served the human machinery of his cult. They produced bread for offerings, weaved linen for robes, cleaned the grounds, and maintained the temple's appearance of divine perfection. Some were given religious tasks, perhaps caring for sacred animals or preparing incense, but their service wasn't voluntary. They didn't choose devotion. They were born into it, or captured for it, or sold into it. And while their names might be recorded in temple logs, their souls were not honored in any divine scrolls. The language of the time reflected this hierarchy. There were many terms for slave or servant: hem, back, SQ or W, each implying different levels of submission, but all meant the same thing: someone who did not own their own life. And unlike the elite classes, slaves had no tombs, no grave goods, no memorials carved in limestone. Their deaths were as unrecorded as their births. They lived, worked, and died in the background of history, forgotten by the people who used them, erased from the stories that Egypt told itself. Yet we know they were there. Archaeological digs have uncovered their bones, bent spines from field labor, broken teeth from malnutrition, healed fractures from abuse. We've found shackles, collars, crude shelters near quarries. We've seen graffiti carved into the stone of workers' villages, simple marks, often desperate ones, perhaps names, perhaps prayers. Some tried to escape. In Deir el Medina, the village of artisans who built the royal tombs, records describe runaway servants. One scribe notes that the Syrian girl fled on the night of the festival. Another laments a boy stolen by bandits, or perhaps gone to the desert. Their fates were not recorded. Probably they were caught, or died trying. And what about emotions? Did owners love their slaves? Possibly. Some inscriptions praise a faithful servant, or mourn a beloved nurse. But this affection did not erase the power dynamic. A beloved slave could still be sold, or punished, or left behind when fortunes shifted. Slavery was not a flaw in the Egyptian system. It was the foundation. The monuments, the granaries, the luxury of the elite, All of it depended on human beings being treated as tools. It was invisible because it was normal. It was brutal because it was unquestioned. And for those trapped inside it, there was no freedom of the mind, no ideology of rebellion, no whispered dreams of revolution. To be born a slave in Egypt was to accept your fate, or to be broken trying not to. The pyramids may stand as symbols of human greatness, but they are also silent witnesses to lives owned and forgotten. The hands that placed those stones, the backs that broke beneath their weight, are gone, unnamed, and the sand has covered their footsteps. If you woke up in ancient Egypt, ready to face a brutal day of sun, labor, taxes, or temple duties, you would need energy, but you wouldn't be reaching for bacon and eggs. There would be no fruit smoothie, no espresso. What you get instead was a daily encounter with two culinary themes: grain and more grain, seasoned, if you were lucky, with a little bit of sand. Not for texture, just because it was everywhere. The ancient Egyptian diet, while nutritious in theory, was deeply tied to geography, class, and necessity. It revolved around what the Nile could provide, and what the grinding stones could produce. And while nobles dined on honey-drenched pastries and fattened ducks, the average peasant's daily meals were more dental emergencies waiting to happen. Let's start with the basics. Bread. Bread was everything. It was not just food. It was a form of currency, a religious offering, a unit of labor payment, and a daily staple from childhood to death. It was made from emmer wheat or barley, both of which are hardy grains suited to Egypt's climate and soil. These grains were harvested during the flood recession period of the Nile, and stored in granaries, carefully guarded and managed, because without them, everyone starved. Now, to make bread, you had to first grind the grain, and here comes your dental nightmare. Ancient Egyptian homes used cornstones, big, flat grinding surfaces, where a woman, yes, always a woman, would kneel for hours, rocking a heavy upper stone back and forth over the grain. Over time, tiny chips of quartz and grit from the stone would break off and mix into the flour. These bits were invisible, tasteless, and deadly for your teeth. Every bite of bread came with a little crunch, not from seeds, from minerals. Examinations of ancient Egyptian skeletons routinely show severe dental wear, molars ground down to the roots, enamel completely stripped. Cavities weren't the main problem. Mechanical erosion was. The constant chewing of sandy bread wore teeth flat. Then infections crept in. Abscesses formed. Some jaws were so damaged that holes had developed from inside the mouth to the outside cheek. Pain wasn't occasional. It was constant. And there were no dentists. No Novocaine. You suffered. You chewed through it. Bread wasn't just for humans. It was also made for the gods. Tombs are filled with models of bakeries. Little scenes of workers kneading, shaping, baking, as a way to symbolically provide for the deceased in the afterlife. Pharaohs and nobles had elaborate bread molds, often with decorations or in animal shapes. The rich might enjoy sweetened or spiced bread, flavored with dates, figs, or carob. The poor, coarse, flat, and barely salted, a mouthful of gravel, but it filled your stomach. Next up, beer. Beer was the second pillar of the diet. It wasn't an optional luxury, it was a liquid meal. Brewed thick and porridge-like, it was made by fermenting partially baked loaves of bread in water, often in large ceramic jars. It was cloudy, warm, and full of yeast. If you were lucky, it might have a little flavor from herbs or dates. If not, it tasted like sour barley sludge, but it was calorie-dense, cheap, and mildly alcoholic, enough to take the edge off the pain in your teeth, your back, your life. Beer was drunk by everyone: men, women, children, priests, builders. Workers on government projects, including pyramid and tomb builders, were paid in daily rations of bread and beer. It kept you going. It hydrated you, somewhat. It numbed you, just enough. And because it was boiled and fermented, it was actually safer to drink than raw Nile water, which was full of parasites and pathogens. So you had your bread, you had your beer. What else? Vegetables were common, if not always exciting. Onions and garlic were staples, easy to grow, flavorful, and believed to have medicinal properties. Workers were often paid in them, and one papyrus records a strike among pyramid builders when their garlic rations were cut. Lentils and chips were also widespread. Leeks, radishes, and cucumbers made appearances. The occasional cabbage or lettuce, if in season. Everything was seasonal, of course. There were no refrigerators, no imports from Peru or Indonesia. Fruits, if you were lucky. Dates were the most common, high in sugar, easy to preserve, and a favorite in both cooking and ritual offerings. Figs were also common and were sometimes dried or baked into cakes. Grapes were a bit more upscale. You might have had some in wine if you were elite, but not on the peasant table. Sycamore figs, which are a different species, were sometimes described as gritty and unpleasant. Another chance to chew on tree bark for dessert. Meat was rare for commoners. Most people went weeks, even months, without eating meat unless there was a festival or a sacrifice. If you were very poor, meat was something you smelled when it was cooking in someone else's house. If you were moderately poor, you might eat it during religious festivals, where shared animals were slaughtered. Goat, lamb, or cattle were for the higher ranks. Pigs were sometimes eaten, but their status varied. They were seen as unclean by priests, but common enough among rural folk. Duck and goose were prized, but unless you worked in a temple or noble household, you weren't getting a bite. Fish were more accessible. The Nile teemed with fish, and if you lived near the water and had time, you might catch catfish, perch, or tilapia. Fish were dried, salted, and eaten whole. But again, bones, scales, grit. Every bite was a risk to your already fragile teeth. Dairy was limited. Milk spoiled quickly in the heat. Butter and cheese were occasionally made, but not in large quantities. You might get goat or cow milk, but unless you lived near the animal, it was unlikely. Most peasants got their calcium from bones, often quite literally, as bone fragments, and marrow were boiled into soups when available. Eggs. Chickens hadn't yet reached Egypt during much of its early and middle history. Ducks and geese laid eggs, but again, they were rare. An egg was a treat, not a breakfast standard. And then there were the additives. Salt, if you could afford it, was used sparingly. Spices were limited to what was locally grown, mustard seeds, perhaps coriander or cumin. Honey was valuable, reserved for rituals or the rich. Sugar didn't exist. If you wanted sweetness, it came from dates or fruit. You weren't baking cupcakes. You were surviving. What about cooking? Food was mostly cooked over small clay hearths. Pots were placed over open fires or hot coals. Bread was baked in domed ovens or on flat stones. There were no chimneys, so most homes filled with smoke during cooking. If you were indoors, your eyes stung. If you were outdoors, the wind made it worse. There were no utensils as we know them. You ate with your hands, dipping bread into stews or beer mush. You gnawed meat from bones. And you washed your hands in the Nile, which, again, was not especially clean. Meals were communal and informal. The idea of breakfast, lunch, and dinner as separate affairs didn't quite apply. People ate when they could, often early in the morning before the heat, again at midday, and in the evening. The main goal was to stay alive, not to dine with elegance. Religious restrictions also influenced the diet. Priests had to eat richly pure food. No pork, no fish with scales missing, no impure offerings. In some periods, even onions were banned in temples. Food was not just sustenance, it was morality. What you ate said something about your soul. And yet, despite the harshness, there was a certain rhythm. Bread and beer, every day, without fail. Sometimes with onions, sometimes with lentils, sometimes, on rare lucky days, with a sliver of meat or fig paste. It was monotonous, but reliable. And for the ancient Egyptian peasant, that was a kind of stability. Still, your teeth were the real victims. Dentists studying ancient remains routinely describe them as some of the most damaged in antiquity. The average Egyptian adult had tooth pain every single day. Abscesses could spread into the jaw, into the brain. Some deaths were likely caused not by plague or violence, but by infected molars. And you kept chewing because there was nothing else. No soft bread, no food processor, no dental plan. Just sand, stone ground grain, and the knowledge that tomorrow's meal would feel exactly like today's. Crunch. If there's one image everyone has in their mind when they think of ancient Egypt, it's the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its towering perfection, its eternal silhouette against the desert sky. The modern myth tells us that it was built by a joyful and well-fed workforce, singing songs as they moved limestone blocks with nothing but ropes, clever engineering, and national pride. Perhaps they even had a union and dental benefits. But let's be honest, ancient Egypt wasn't a place where back-breaking labor was optional. And when it came to building monuments, temples, tombs, and irrigation systems, the hands that did the lifting weren't always free. Whether you were a peasant roped into the pharaoh's massive state projects, or someone outright enslaved and owned by the crown or the temple, odds are your contribution to Egyptian greatness came with blisters, bruises, and a distinct lack of choice. Let's clear up one thing first. The pyramids were not built by slaves in chains. That idea, popularized by old Hollywood films and some religious texts, has been largely debunked by archaeologists. The workers who constructed the Great Pyramid of Khufu around 2500 BCE were not enslaved, but they weren't free citizens on a passion project either. Most of them were part of what's known as corvée labor, a form of mandatory, state-imposed service that Egyptians owed to the government. It was a civic tax, paid not in silver or grain, but in sweat. If you were a commoner, especially a man during your prime years, you could be summoned for a month or more at a time to serve in the pharaoh's projects. This could mean hauling stone, digging canals, harvesting crops, or rebuilding roads. You didn't get to say no. There was no opt-out form. The Nile flood had receded, farming was slow, and now it was your turn to work for the state. These corvée workers were organized into teams, housed in dormitory-style accommodations, and fed rations of bread, onions, beer, and sometimes meat. They were likely proud of their work, especially on major monuments. Some graffiti left behind suggests team names like the Drunkards of Menkaure or the Friends of Khufu. It all sounds almost cheerful until you remember the conditions. These men worked in the desert heat, moving multi-ton stones with primitive tools and no mechanical assistance. Injuries were common: smashed fingers, broken legs, crushed limbs. You were lucky if all you suffered was sunstroke and fatigue. There were no safety regulations, no health days off. You worked until you collapsed. Then someone else took your place. For many Egyptians, this was simply a fact of life. The state demanded labor. The pharaoh was a living god. Building for him was building for eternity. But this doesn't mean they were happy, or well compensated, or remembered. Most of their names are lost to time. Their bones lie under the sand near the pyramids, bearing the marks of hard, unnatural toil. Now let's move a step lower on the ladder. Enslaved people. Ancient Egyptian slavery didn't always look like the plantation-style systems of the modern era. Some enslaved individuals lived in households and were treated more like property than livestock, but others, especially war captives, endured extreme brutality. These included Nubians, Libyans, and Asiatics taken in military campaigns, marched back to Egypt in chains, and distributed to temples, nobles, or the state itself. These enslaved people worked in a variety of settings. Some were domestic workers, cooking, cleaning, and nursing children for elite families. Others were field hands on estates owned by temples or the pharaoh. And then there were those sent to the quarries and mines. These were the worst assignments. In the quarries, enslaved people carved granite from the living rock with copper chisels and wooden mallets under blistering sun. In the mines of Nubia or the Sinai Peninsula, they dug deep for gold, turquoise, and malachite, inhaling poisonous dust and risking tunnel collapses. The state kept records of these workers, but only in terms of value. 5 Nubian males assigned to gold mine 3. 2 Asiatic females for house service. Their names rarely mattered. They were inventory. And here's the uncomfortable truth. There was no legal recourse for these individuals. If you were enslaved in Egypt, you had no rights. You couldn't file a complaint. You couldn't escape without being hunted down. You belonged to someone, either a person, a temple, or the state. Temples, in fact, were major slaveholders. The cult of Amun-Karnak, one of the richest religious institutions in Egypt, owned vast tracts of land and hundreds, if not thousands, of workers, many of them enslaved. These individuals were born into servitude or brought in as captives. They ground grain, baked bread, cleaned altars, and repaired temple walls, all to keep the gods and the priesthood pleased. There's another category to consider: debt slavery. This was when someone fell into financial ruin, usually due to crop failure, illness, or tax debt, and had to sell themselves or a family member into servitude. Sometimes this was temporary. Theoretically, once the debt was paid, you could regain your freedom, but that often didn't happen. Debts could last generations, and once in servitude, it was hard to prove that anything was temporary. Children born to enslaved mothers typically inherited their mother's status. This wasn't about fairness, it was about labor supply. If a household or temple invested in raising a child, they expected returns. That return was lifelong service, unpaid, unchosen, unfree. Now, back to the myth of the happy pyramid workers. Where did this story come from? Part of it stems from archaeological discoveries at workers' villages like the one at Giza. These sites show that some workers received decent food rations and had medical care. Skeletal remains show healed injuries, suggesting they weren't simply abandoned when hurt. That's true for some of the workers, likely the skilled artisans, foremen, or specialists. But for the unskilled laborers, the ones hauling blocks, carrying water, mixing mortar, the story was different. Their skeletons show repetitive stress injuries, compressed spines, and worn joints. Many died young, and there are mass graves nearby, rows of bodies buried with little ceremony. If this was state-sponsored pride, it had a high mortality rate. And of course, none of this includes the enslaved people working in nearby stone quarries or carrying food supplies. They weren't housed in dorms. They weren't memorialized. They were used and discarded. To build anything in Egypt, whether it was a pyramid, a tomb, a canal, or a storage facility, required enormous amounts of labor. That labor wasn't cheap. It was extracted through taxation, obligation, conquest, or purchase. Even in the villages of skilled workers, like Deir el-Medina, which housed the artisans who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, conditions could be harsh. These men were not slaves, but they lived in isolated communities, worked in secretive teams, and were under the control of state officials. Records show strikes when rations were delayed, and conflicts over payment. One letter complains that workers were so hungry they could no longer function, and these were the elite builders. Imagine what life was like for everyone else. In the end, ancient Egypt's monumental achievements weren't born of harmony or voluntary collaboration. They were born of control, of a society where obedience was demanded, where labor was extracted by force or necessity, and where human bodies were spent in the service of immortality. The pharaohs got their tombs, the gods got their temples, and the people got arthritis, abscesses, and a legacy carved not in stone, but in silence. So, you've come down with something in ancient Egypt. Maybe it's just a cough, maybe it's the flu, or maybe that bad air from the canal gods has lodged itself in your liver and is now trying to escape through your skin. Either way, you're in for a treat, because healthcare in ancient Egypt was a peculiar blend of genuine medical insight, wild guesswork, aggressive optimism, and a whole lot of magic spells. Welcome to one of the oldest medical systems on Earth, and perhaps one of the strangest. You won't be receiving anesthesia, but someone might whisper an incantation to your spleen while rubbing your feet with fermented goose fat. Let's begin at the beginning. How did ancient Egyptians understand illness? To them, disease was both physical and spiritual. The body could malfunction due to natural causes, rotten food, injury, insect bites, or imbalanced bodily fluids. But most often, illness was believed to be caused by malevolent forces, angry gods, offended spirits, curses, or demons that entered through your mouth or breath. Sometimes it was just fate. Other times, you were clearly being punished for something. Doctors, called sunu, were trained professionals. They weren't magicians. Those were Hika priests. But in practice, there was overlap. You might go to a sunu for your infected foot, but he might still chant a protective spell, as he smeared it with medicinal paste. That's because ancient Egyptian medicine wasn't divided between science and magic the way it is today. If something worked, they used it, whether it came from a field herb or a sacred scroll. Many medical practices were recorded in documents we still have today, like the Ebers Papyrus, written around 1550 BCE. It's a 110-page scroll of medical instructions, covering everything from bone fractures to baldness to crocodile bites. It includes over 700 remedies, many of which involve precise measurements of ingredients, things like honey, dates, resin, myrrh, onion juice, moldy bread, and animal dung. Some of these were genuinely effective, others less so. Take a common cold. The Ebers Papyrus might recommend a mixture of honey, incense, and herbs heated into a steam and inhaled. Honestly, not a bad idea. The honey had antibacterial properties. The steam cleared your nose. But in other cases, you might be advised to wear a protective amulet shaped like a frog, or to rub your chest with fat from a snake. Not quite FDA approved. If you had a fever, you could try a poultice of fig paste. If that didn't work, it was probably a ghost trying to exit your body through your feet. Better chant a spell and sprinkle some beer over your bed. Broken bones. Egyptian medicine actually handled these surprisingly well. Some doctors could realign fractures, using splints made from bark or linen. Dislocations could be set with manual manipulation. They knew how to bind wounds with honey-soaked linen, which helped prevent infection. In fact, their use of honey and copper-based salves had genuine antibacterial effects, some of which modern science has confirmed. But infections were a huge problem. If your wound got contaminated, which was almost guaranteed, you could develop a pus-filled abscess, or worse. There were no antibiotics, no surgical gloves, no sterile instruments. Even small cuts could be fatal, and surgical procedures were rare and risky. Most interventions involved topical applications, prayers, and hope. Eye problems were extremely common, thanks to the ever-present dust, sand, and sun. Conjunctivitis, infections, and styes made life miserable. Remedies included applying mashed vegetables, applying lizard fat, or reciting chants to the god Horus. Sometimes, you'd use a blend of black coal and natron, which helped but also potentially made things worse if not cleaned properly. Now, let's say you had a stomach issue. Ancient Egyptian food was often coarse, sandy, and full of bacteria. Diarrhea and food poisoning were routine. You might be prescribed a mixture of charcoal, cumin, and crushed dates. Or, if you were unlucky, the doctor might suggest swallowing a cleansing mix of clay, beer, and castor oil. If the contents didn't make you sick, the flavor probably would. Parasites were another everyday reality. The Nile was home to all kinds of worms, snails, and pathogens. Schistosomiasis, caused by parasitic flatworms, was incredibly common. People suffered from bloated stomachs, fatigue, and blood in the urine, but they didn't understand what caused it. Remedies often involved magical amulets or chants to protect the kidneys, which were seen as channels for malevolent spirits. Then there were the mental health problems, which the Egyptians saw through a spiritual lens. If someone acted strangely, saw visions, or shouted uncontrollably, they were often considered to be possessed by spirits or influenced by divine forces. Treatment might involve exorcism spells, herbal incense, or isolation. No one thought of depression or anxiety as illnesses. If you were sad, you were probably just cursed. Women's health was also covered, though not gently. Midwives handled childbirth, and the Ebers Papyrus contains instructions for testing pregnancy. A woman would urinate on barley and emmer wheat seeds. If the seeds sprouted, she was pregnant. Modern science has tested this and found it to be somewhat accurate due to hormone presence. Not bad, ancient Egypt. But childbirth was still extremely dangerous. There were no surgical options for complications. If labor went badly, The mother and baby often died. There were no antiseptics, no painkillers, just incense, lull, and prayers to Tavaret, the hippo goddess of childbirth. Birth control also existed, sort of. Some recipes advised inserting a mixture of crocodile dung and honey into the vagina to block conception. You read that correctly. Others involved acacia gum, which may have had mild spermicidal properties. But in general, family planning was less of a science and more of an experiment. Death, unfortunately, was the final medical outcome for many, and when it came, medicine gave way to magic entirely. The preparation of the body for mummification involved special priests, called embalmers, who knew which oils, salts, and resins to use. But even this process was cloaked in incantations, ritual phrases, and protective spells. You didn't just die, you transitioned. Hopefully, it's worth noting that healthcare was not equally available to everyone. Nobles and priests had access to the best trained doctors. Temples often functioned as healing centers, where the ill could receive both treatment and divine blessings. But peasants had to make do with village healers, home remedies, and whatever charms they could afford. And affordability mattered. Medical treatment wasn't free. Even an herbal cure might cost grain, beer, or labor in exchange. So if your child had a fever, your choices were 1. Pay the healer, 2. Recite a spell over a jar of garlic water, or 3. Wait and hope. Many opted for the spell. So, what can we say about ancient Egyptian healthcare? It was creative, it was deeply spiritual, and it was based on observation, trial, and quite a bit of magical thinking. They understood certain concepts, like cleanliness, wound care, and the importance of diet. But without microscopes, germ theory, or chemistry, they relied heavily on what they could see, feel, and imagine. And often, what they imagined was invisible spirits floating into your body through your ears. Which is, in fairness, not much worse than going on the internet and diagnosing yourself with 14 rare diseases after a sneeze. But if you got the flu in ancient Egypt, your treatment was unpredictable. You might survive with a poultice and honey. You might die from dehydration. Or you might be sent to a priest who sprinkled beer over your head while chanting the names of Horus. In short, ancient Egyptian medicine was a gamble. You were rolling the dice with every cough. And if all else failed, well, there was always the afterlife, assuming you could afford it. If you were a woman in ancient Egypt, your life was already planned out long before you could say, papyrus scroll. You were born, likely not celebrated as much as a son, raised to be quiet, obedient, and industrious, and expected to marry young, bear children early, and never question the order of things. And while some people like to point out that ancient Egyptian women had more rights than in many other ancient societies, which is technically true, it's a little like saying a lion cage with windows is better than one without. You're still not getting out. Yes, women in ancient Egypt could own property, inherit land, and file for divorce. But don't let that fool you into picturing a society of empowered queens walking around in linen suits running businesses. For the vast majority of women, life was defined by domestic labor, childbearing, and obedience. It was not glamorous, it was not fair, and it was not optional. Let's begin with childhood. Girls in ancient Egypt had a brief window of relative freedom before the societal machine swallowed them whole. They played with dolls, small clay animals, and miniature household tools, a charming foreshadowing of the adult responsibilities to come. There was no formal school for most girls. Education was for boys, especially those destined for priesthood or bureaucracy. Girls stayed home, learning from their mothers how to cook, clean, grind grain, spin thread, and manage a household. If you showed aptitude for music or dance, you might entertain in the household or even work in a temple, though that came with its own set of limitations and risks. By the age of 12 or 13, a girl was considered marriageable, and marriageable was often just a polite way of saying ready for childbirth. Most marriages were arranged, and while women technically had the legal right to accept or refuse a marriage, in practice, they had little say. Your future husband might be a farmer, a merchant, a scribe, or someone twice your age. You didn't marry for love. You married because it was expected, and because survival often depended on forming stable family units. Once married, your job description expanded: wife, housekeeper, weaver, cook, grain grinder, laundry washer, and most importantly, mother. And let's talk about motherhood, because this was central to a woman's value. Producing children, especially sons, was how women secured their place in the family and society. If you didn't have children, you were pitied or quietly replaced. If you had daughters, you were politely congratulated. If you had sons, you were worth celebrating. But pregnancy and childbirth were terrifying prospects. There was no medical care as we understand it today. No prenatal vitamins, no ultrasounds, no emergency cesarines. You were helped by a midwife, if one was available, who would rely on experience, herbal treatments, and prayers to the gods. The goddess Taveret, a hippo-like deity with a crocodile tail and lion paws, was the protector of childbirth. Small statues of her were kept in homes, and women prayed to her for safe deliveries. Labor could last hours or days, with no pain relief, no sterile conditions, and no guarantee of survival. Death during childbirth was common. If the baby was breech or the mother hemorrhaged, there was little anyone could do. If both survived, it was a triumph, and a temporary one. Infant mortality was extremely high. Malnutrition, infections, and disease meant many children didn't make it past age 5, and there was no rest for mothers. As soon as a baby was born, the next cycle began: breastfeeding, weaning, another pregnancy. Women could spend their entire adult lives either pregnant or recovering from pregnancy. Contraception existed in theory, using things like honey, acacia gum, or crocodile dung inserted vaginally, but their effectiveness was highly questionable, and they weren't widely available or reliable. Beyond the physical strain, there was the emotional toll. A woman might lose several children before one survived. She might be blamed for infertility even if the problem was her husband. And in a household with multiple wives or concubines, a not uncommon situation, there was competition for attention, resources, and status. And then there was the domestic labor. Running a home in ancient Egypt was an endless job. There were no appliances, no store-bought bread, no clean running water. Women ground grain daily using large stone slabs, an exhausting process that left many with repetitive stress injuries. They fetched water from the river or canals, washed clothes by hand, prepared meals from scratch, cared for animals, and spun and wove linen for clothing. Even in households that could afford servants or enslaved laborers, the wife was still expected to oversee everything. She was the manager, the worker, and the safety net. If anything went wrong, it was her fault. If anything went right, it was probably the husband's success. Now, let's look at the social structure. Elite women, wives of priests, officials, or nobles, had more material comfort, but were still constrained. They were expected to remain indoors, maintain appearances, and bear children to secure dynastic stability. They might have education, own property, and even supervise estates, but always under the authority of a male guardian. One notable exception, of course, is Hatshepsut, who ruled as pharaoh in the 15th century BCE. She wore the false beard of kingship, commissioned massive temples, and led military expeditions. But she was an anomaly, and after her death, later rulers tried to erase her from history. Her statues were defaced, her name scrubbed from inscriptions. Even in power, a woman had to fight to be remembered. Most women had no such legacy. They lived and died in obscurity, their names lost, their graves unmarked. Their lives were vital to society, raising children, feeding families, preserving traditions, but their labor was invisible. And what if you didn't marry? What if you were widowed, divorced, or simply alone? In theory, women could inherit property and run households. Widows had some legal autonomy, but in reality, single women were vulnerable. Without a male protector, father, husband, son, or brother, you were exposed to exploitation, financial hardship, and social isolation. Divorce was technically possible and sometimes initiated by women, but it often left them with few resources and limited support. And then there's the religious sphere. Some women served as priestesses, musicians, or temple dancers. The most powerful female religious role was the god's wife of Ammon, a politically influential title usually held by a royal woman. But again, this was rare. Most women had no religious authority. They participated in household rituals, made offerings, and prayed for fertility. But the public and formal priesthood was a male domain. In art, women are often depicted as graceful, silent companions, standing behind their husbands, offering them flowers, or clasping their arms. Even in death, women were depicted as submissive. Tomb inscriptions praised wives for being quiet in the house, loyal, and obedient. Love poetry exists, and some women clearly had affection in their marriages, but the social ideal was always the same: silent endurance. So yes, Egyptian women had rights. Compared to some other ancient cultures, they could own property, they could go to court, they could divorce their husbands, but they were also expected to produce children constantly, work endlessly, remain silent, and die young, often from the very roles that defined them. Life for a woman in ancient Egypt was not gilded romance under the pyramids. It was grinding wheat while 9 months pregnant. It was watching your child die of fever. It was surviving a brutal world with no voice, no rest, and no room for error. And if you somehow made it through all of that, you still weren't allowed to write your own history. Life in ancient Egypt might look serene from the outside. Majestic pyramids, calm Nile waters, and statues smiling serenely at the desert sun. But scratch beneath that polished surface, and you find a daily world full of dangers, accidents, and a surprising amount of violence. It wasn't all curses and plagues. Sometimes, the gods were angry because you slipped on a wet floor, or your neighbor got into a fist fight over stolen grain. Welcome to the brutal reality, where fate, gravity, and human tempers combine to make everyday life a gamble with death and injury. First, let's talk about accidents, because they were terrifyingly common and often fatal. The physical environment of ancient Egypt was harsh. The Nile flooded seasonally, bringing fertile soil, but also dangerous waters that could drown or sweep away the unwary. Farmers working in fields faced sharp tools, unpredictable animals, and crushing loads of heavy grain sacks. They had no safety equipment, no helmets, no gloves. Imagine walking barefoot on rough limestone slabs, or climbing slippery stone steps to maintain the irrigation canals. One false move and you could fall, break a limb, or hit your head on a jagged rock. Broken bones were common, and without modern medicine, many of these injuries became infected or never healed properly. Construction sites were another deadly arena. The building of temples, pyramids, and tombs required thousands of laborers lifting massive stones, hoisting them with primitive cranes, and balancing precariously on scaffolding made of wood and rope. Falls from height were frequent, and the resulting injuries often meant death or permanent disability. You might think the famous pyramid builders were glorified craftsmen, but the reality was grim. These workers toiled under grueling conditions for months or years, suffering from exhaustion, dehydration, and musculoskeletal injuries. Broken ribs, crushed fingers, and twisted backs were part of everyday life. But accidents weren't just limited to construction or farming. Simple domestic tasks could also be dangerous. Carrying water from the Nile, often in large clay jars on your head, could cause strain and falls. Cooking over open fires risked burns and smoke inhalation. Knives and sickles used for food preparation or harvesting could cause deep cuts. Add to this the presence of wild animals, snakes, scorpions, crocodiles, and spiders. Bites and stings were common, and without antivenoms, they could be deadly. Even domesticated animals like oxen could accidentally gore or trample people. Now, combine these hazards with human violence, and you get a society where personal security was never guaranteed. Despite the serene art and peaceful temples, ancient Egypt was not a pacifist utopia. Fights, theft, and assaults were frequent. Some evidence comes from court records and graffiti, scrawled complaints and legal disputes that show people dealing with violence, often over land, grain, or insults. Violence could erupt over the smallest provocations, a stolen chicken, a disagreement over water rights, or a public insult. The social pressure to maintain honor and face meant that men sometimes fought with fists, clubs, knives, or even makeshift weapons like broken pottery. Domestic violence was also present. Women and children were vulnerable to abuse, although written records are scarce because such matters were often kept private. Still, tomb scenes hint at strict patriarchal control and the expectation that wives and children obeyed male heads of households. The law did exist to punish violence, but it was often inconsistent. Courts sometimes fined offenders, imposed labor penalties, or in extreme cases, ordered corporal punishment, but enforcement was uneven, especially in rural areas, where local chiefs or elders handled disputes. There was also military violence. Egypt was frequently involved in conflicts with neighboring states like Nubia, Libya, and the Levant. Soldiers endured brutal battles, facing arrows, spears, and chariots. Casualties were high, and surviving veterans often returned maimed or traumatized. Yet, even outside official warfare, the threat of bandits and highway robbers was real. Travelers on dusty roads risked ambush. Markets could turn violent if disputes escalated. Towns had guards, but their protection wasn't foolproof. One particularly interesting aspect was the role of the gods in explaining violence and accidents. If you slipped and broke your arm, it wasn't just bad luck. Maybe you offended a god. Perhaps you neglected a ritual or angered a local spirit. Illness, injury, and accidents were often seen as divine punishment or the result of malevolent forces. So, after a fall or fight, you might visit a temple to offer sacrifices, or have a priest perform a purification ritual. Magic amulets, spells, and protective charms were common defenses against both physical harm and spiritual attack. But the gods could be fickle. No amount of offerings guaranteed safety. The daily risk of harm was just part of life's cosmic balance. Interestingly, the Egyptians documented some of their injuries in medical papyri, like the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which contains early surgical techniques for treating wounds and fractures. This shows they understood trauma and tried to intervene, even if success was limited. Still, the combination of environmental hazards, physical labor, interpersonal violence, and unpredictable divine wrath made daily existence precarious. Imagine walking home from the market, carrying your goods. When a scorpion bites your ankle, you stumble, fall on the uneven path, spraining your wrist. Nearby, a drunken argument breaks out between neighbors, escalating to a fistfight. You try to avoid it, but get caught in the scuffle, receiving a nasty cut. When you finally reach your home, you might find your wife worried over the newborn, who is coughing badly and might not survive the night. This was the brutal reality for most ancient Egyptians, not gods watching over them in peace, but forces of chance, violence, and misfortune constantly threatening their survival. So the next time you see a serene statue of an Egyptian pharaoh, or a wall painting of a calm Nile sunset, remember the chaos lurking behind it. Life was not peaceful or easy. It was messy, painful, and dangerous, because in ancient Egypt, even the gods didn't promise you safety from the fall. When we think about ancient Egypt, most people picture golden tombs, mysterious hieroglyphs, and towering pyramids basking under the desert sun. It's a civilization shrouded in myth and wonder, celebrated for its artistic achievements, religious beliefs, and architectural feats. But beneath the glamour and grandeur, life in ancient Egypt was brutal, harsh, and unforgiving. The legacy of that brutal survival still echoes today, in unexpected ways. Let's explore how the daily struggles, the social structures, and the relentless fight against nature and society in ancient Egypt have shaped or mirrored some aspects of our modern world. First, consider the impact on labor and social hierarchies. The ancient Egyptian system was rigidly hierarchical, with a tiny elite controlling the vast majority of resources and wealth, while the masses, farmers, laborers, and slaves, bore the burden of survival. This social stratification is a familiar story that resonates throughout history and continues today in various forms. we still see extreme inequality worldwide, where a small percentage holds disproportionate wealth and power, while many struggle with poverty, exploitation, and hard labor. The echoes of ancient Egypt's social order can be seen in the disparities of modern capitalism, where the rewards of labor are often unevenly distributed. The brutal working conditions of pyramid builders and farmers are not far removed from the realities faced by many laborers today in industries like construction, agriculture, and manufacturing, jobs marked by physical strain, danger, and minimal protections. Next, there's the legacy of health and medicine. Ancient Egyptians made early advances in medicine. Their doctors documented wounds, fractures, and diseases, and used herbs, surgery, and magical rituals to heal. But their medical knowledge was limited by the tools and understanding of their time. Despite millennia of progress, many parts of the world still lack access to proper health care, leading to high infant mortality, maternal deaths, and untreated injuries, reminders of the precariousness faced by Egyptians thousands of years ago. Even in wealthy societies, accidents and chronic conditions can echo the ancient struggle for survival. Our modern health systems owe some roots to early practices documented in papyri, but the fragility of human life remains a constant. Then there's the gender dynamics and women's roles. The position of women in ancient Egypt, able to own property and engage in legal acts but confined by societal expectations, and often subject to harsh conditions, has a parallel in many contemporary societies, where women continue to fight for equal rights, representation, and safety. The brutal expectations placed on women for childbearing and domestic labor echo in ongoing struggles with reproductive rights, domestic violence, and gender inequality. While progress has been made, echoes of the ancient world's strict gender roles still reverberate. Another legacy lies in how people cope with risk, uncertainty, and mortality. The ancient Egyptians turned to religion, magic, and rituals to manage their fears, praying to gods, wearing amulets, and performing ceremonies to ward off illness, injury, and misfortune. Today, humans continue to seek comfort in belief systems, rituals, and symbols to deal with uncertainty and the inevitability of death. Whether through organized religion, superstition, or personal spirituality, this desire to find meaning and protection against life's dangers connects us to our ancient ancestors. Finally, the very architecture and monuments of Egypt reflect a human desire to resist mortality, to create something lasting amidst brutality. The pyramids were not just tombs, they were statements of power, attempts to conquer death, and symbols of cultural identity. Their survival through millennia reminds us how humans respond to harshness by building, creating, and remembering. Our modern memorials, art, and cultural achievements carry this same impulse to find permanence in an impermanent world. In sum, while ancient Egyptian life was brutal and unforgiving, it was also a foundation for many patterns and struggles that continue today. From social inequality and labor exploitation to gender dynamics and the quest for meaning, the echoes of that harsh past ripple through history into our present. So, when you look at the serene faces, carved in stone or the intricate hieroglyphs, telling stories of gods and kings, remember they hide stories of suffering, resilience, and survival. Because understanding the brutality of ancient life doesn't just teach us history, it teaches us about ourselves.